and we have to really escalate the noise we make so that we'll be heard.
Welcome to Gay USA. I'm Andy Hum.
I'm Ann Northrup. Can I look a little more at your height? Yes.
And I don't know why I'm smiling, because Christian nationalism, if you haven't noticed, is on the rise. And we're very excited to have as our guest at the top of the show, Katherine Stewart, who has been tracking the trend for decades and is here to help us understand it and how it escalated and what can be done maybe to counter it.
I certainly hope so. And we are also excited by some legal wins in the last week in Florida, Utah, and Michigan.
California Governor Newsom has nominated the first out lesbian to serve on the state's high court.
Yeah, even as he vetoed the safe injection sites. Connecticut is on the verge of electing the first out gay Black statewide official in the whole United States.
I'm going to tell you about Libertarian lesbian author Norah Vincent, who has died at the age of 53.
That was a shocker. In Singapore, it's one step forward and one step blocking further progress on gay issues, gay people.
So positivity for monkeypox is falling in the latest report in the United States, and half of gay and bi men have curbed riskier sex. But it ain't over till it's over.
And the much celebrated play Take Me Out is coming back to Broadway.
Okay, well, we welcome Katherine Stewart. Where are you, Katherine?
She's coming.
Hello. Katherine, for those of you who don't know, is a leading journalist and author of The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. We had her on back in 2012 when she published The Good News Club, the Christian right's stealth assault on America's children. Well, it's not very stealth anymore. Welcome back, Katherine, and over to you, Ann.
Well, thank you, Katherine. And I have to compliment you on that book cover because it really sums it up. The cross above the American flag. We are all terrified these days. Any watchers of our show know that we sit here week after week now, just scared out of our minds about this attempt to take over the United States by the Christian right wing. So let's start by asking how real a danger is this from your perspective? You've been following these people for a very long time.
Yeah, the danger, I think on a scale of 1 to 10, we're at a 15. The danger is very real. This is a movement that has been organizing for decades. I think to understand the threat, you need to understand a little bit about the movement. It's not just an anti-democratic ideology saying that the United States was founded as a so-called Christian nation. Our laws should be based on the Bible, and sort of supposedly right-thinking Christians need to take it back. It's also an organized quest for power, a political movement, and it consists of all of the features of, I would say, democratic infrastructure, like right-wing policy groups, legal advocacy groups, networking organizations, that get movement leadership on the same page, like organizations like the Council for National Policy, which gets them in line and also puts them together with donors, a vast sort of far-right messaging sphere. The movement also operates a lot through religious infrastructure. We can talk a little more about that later. They know very well if you can get the pastors, you can get their congregants to vote for the hyper-conservative political candidates that the movement favors. So they organize pastors into networks like Watchmen on the Wall, Church United, Faith Wins, and these types of organizations, and give them all these messaging tools.
All right. Well, this is a lot to absorb, clearly. So let's try to. I know we don't have 6 years to discuss this, much as we'd like to. I'm old enough to remember the John Birch Society and the Barry Goldwater campaign, and I assume some of this started the kernels around then. But I also remember before then that this didn't seem like an issue, although I suspect you'll tell me it goes back much further than that. But can you give us just a sense of how and when and why this all started?
This is a movement that has very deep roots in American history. I think we can trace it back in some ways to the pro-slavery theologians, people like Robert Louis Dabney and James Henley Thornwell, who argued for that America was, supposed to be an authentically Christian nation, that there are these hierarchies that are rooted in the Bible. Back then they said, white people over black people, that's God's established order. They said that women should be subordinate to men. Most Christian nationalists.
And excuse me for a second, when was that?
Well, this is the pro-slavery. I'm talking about the pro-slavery theologians around prior to emancipation and even after. Many of these theologians believed in this idea of America as an authentically Christian nation, as they defined it, of course, with laws that should be rooted in a strict and reactionary interpretation of the Bible. And that's actually how they justified slavery.
So that's at least 200 years. Was this debate going on in the so-called, I'll put quotes around it, founding of the country 250 years ago, as the founding fathers were writing the Declaration of Independence and conducting the Revolutionary War? Was this strain of thought prevalent then?
The amazing thing about our founders is that they proudly created the world's first secular republic. They were an interesting collection of folks, very flawed, as all collections of folks are. But the one thing that they did is that they put the Establishment Clause as the most important piece of real estate in our First Amendment. The Establishment Clause is Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And then the next clause is nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But the Establishment Clause was clearly intended to separate church and state. In fact, the separation of church and state is a phrase that flowed from Thomas Jefferson's pen. But what they understood very well is that the way to maintain peace in a diverse society, look, even there was religious diversity, even in our founding. We had Lutherans, we had Episcopalians, we had Puritans, we had, people, some Catholics, people come from all around the country. But we can't forget that many European countries, even though everybody was Christian, there were different types of Christian. They'd been torn apart by religious wars in many instances. And they knew that, first of all, they didn't want to create a monarchy. They wanted to create government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the way to maintain peace in a pluralistic society is to have separation of church and state, so that people are free to worship their faith, if any, but that no one's religion is dominant in governance, and there should be no religious test for public office. That was something that they very explicitly said. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the Christian nationalists today, they're determined to rewrite our history. So they rely on people like David Barton or other sort of pseudo-historians who have really kind of perverted the meaning of what our founders intended.
So we are now at this point where it seems like an overwhelming tsunami of attack. When did this suddenly leap into such a huge issue?
Well, a lot of people point to the rise of a movement called the New Right, and something I've written about in my book, The Power Worshippers, when you had people like Paul Weyrich and Phyllis Schlafly and Howard Phillips feeling like the Republican Party. We're talking about like late 1970s or so. Not Roe versus Wade. When Roe versus Wade passed, most Protestant Republicans supported it. I mean, Southern Baptist Convention published statements affirming support for abortion law liberalization, actually. But this collection of individuals felt the Republican Party had become too liberal, right? Too soft on communism. They were really upset about the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement. They wanted to sort of take the country, take the Republican Party further to the right in order to push the country further to the right. But if we're looking at, where they come from, where like the sort of the ideology of Christian nationalism comes from, I think we can go back even further to some of the mid-century thinkers. There's a fellow named, I was reminded of him, his name is Rousas John Rushdoony. He was a father of a movement called Christian Reconstructionism, which is a form of dominionism or theonomy, the idea of that our laws should be based on a very particular reading of the Bible. And I was reminded of him because there's this candidate, Republican political candidate in Oklahoma, I believe his name is Scott Esk, who recently, somebody found that he had said that he thinks gay people should be stoned, right? And a lot of times, so people hear this, and he said this. I mean, he actually said this, and then he defended this statement. And to most people, including, frankly, most Christians, and he said, well, if I believe that, it's just because I'm a Christian. Now, most Christians would completely disavow the statement, completely disagree with it. And by the way, most American Christians, I think, reject these politics. But there is a certain cohort who stands behind it because, as we know, all the religions are very diverse. And the type of ideology this kind of statement comes from dates, I believe, you can trace it to Rousas John Rushdoony and many of the folks who have admired him or taken on many of his ideas over time. So, for instance, he had this idea of America, just like the pro-slavery theologians. America is an authentically Christian nation. Our laws should be based on the Bible with hierarchies rooted in biblical law. And he actually admired and even republished the works of some of those pro-slavery theologians. And in turn, well, I'll just give you an example. I was speaking earlier about how the larger Christian nationalist movement works through religious infrastructure by drawing pastors into networks. Well, one of the networks is called Watchmen on the Wall. It's an initiative of the Family Research Council. That's one of the leading policy groups of the religious right. The movement, their organization includes tens of thousands of conservative-leaning and conservative pastors. What they do is they give these pastors all these tools for telling them how their congregation should vote, their so-called biblical values, and then they tell them what those biblical values supposedly are. Well, the Watchman on the Wall has quoted Rousas John Rushdoony, So you think about a historical figure like that, and you think, well, I've never heard of this guy. What do his ideas matter? But, many of the leading sort of intellectuals of the movement have published works. I'm thinking about an essay written by Richard John Newhouse, who said that Rushdoony's theonomy, or the idea of America rooted in biblical law, is actually very, it's insinuated into circles where many people would not feel comfortable associated with him. So
we kind of had a panic. We kind of had a panic over this in the 50s, maybe over communism, what they used to call in my day godless communism. And in 1956, we changed the motto of the United States to "In God We Trust." And folks, if you look at your money, it's on every piece of money and coin and bill that you have. And now, all right, so that's there. I mean, that happened, and now states are now saying, put up "In God We Trust" in every classroom in the country. And Florida passed a law that says you have to put it up if somebody donates a framed sign like this. And
is it has Florida to be or Texas? I think it's Texas.
Is this Texas? Oh, you're right. I apologize. It is a Texas law, but other states are doing it or looking at it.
Sure.
So if you look at those "In God We Trust" signs, why are they all of a sudden showing up in all these public schools? Well, that goes back again to that Christian nationalist network. One of the legislative initiatives that I've written about in my book is called Project Blitz. And it involved people like David Barton, that sort of pseudo-historian, and many other folks who are leaders of this movement. And they decided that they were going to inject all of these initiatives into our laws that would conflate in the minds of the public the idea of America with their religion and sort of legitimize their religion. And they organized the legislation. They drafted this model legislation, and they push it out to state lawmakers in all these different states who are on board with the movement's agenda. And one of their initiatives was In God We Trust. They said, we want to put an In God We Trust sign in every public school, every public building, even on every police car in some initiatives. And then, so they drafted this model legislation, and then all of these right-wing politicians take on this legislation and they introduce it as bills. And some of the bills fail, but some of them get through. So what happens is, all of a sudden, it's like, as David Barton said, it's like the other side will be playing whack-a-mole. It'll drive them crazy, but they'll expend a lot of energy, trying to fight this thing. Some of the bills will fail, but a lot of them will get through, and that's exactly what's happened. But it shows the coordination of this movement. We're really good at noticing Christian nationalism, religious nationalism, when, you see a president or a presidential candidate saying stuff like ridiculous stuff, or somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene, these politicians saying things that sound really bizarre. We're not as good at recognizing it when it shows up in our local school boards or when it shows up in local legislation. But this is one of the reasons why it's so important to be engaged on a local level, not just on the national level. Voting is really important. I mean, it's absolutely critical, but it's not enough. We all have to get engaged in local politics to really understand what's happening in our states and in our cities and towns and areas, rural areas.
Well, I am struck these days by, first of all, the explicit speech of the leaders of this movement, who say we want to destroy democracy because we do not believe in majority rule. Majority rule is an evil thing. We believe that we are right and our minority should be ruling. And that seems to be what's happening at the school boards that are banning books, with abortion laws that are being passed. Time after time, we see that the majority of the American people are not in favor of this stuff, and yet these people are winning everywhere.
Except in Kansas, briefly.
Yeah, well, listen, this is what happens when you have a movement that understands the value of the courts. I mean, in advance of the 2016 election, I went to a lot of, in the dozen plus years I've been researching this movement, I go to a lot of right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings and, marches for life, et cetera. And, I've seen so many people stand up there and say, this election is about judges, judges, judges. And then they'll do something like, in one instance, pray that, the Lord Jesus will be King of America once again, things like that. So they're really making a kind of declaration and demonstration of their Christian nationalism, their religious nationalism, the idea that, their idea of God's law should dominate over civil law, and that our law should be based on the Bible. But then also making the rank and file really understand what's at stake in elections. It's not about whether you like the guy or not, or maybe he said something stupid once. A lot of people really justified their vote for Trump because they knew he was going to appoint right-wing justices. And they know if you can get the courts, you can get the country and you can pass these incredibly unpopular laws. Like, for instance, only 14% of Americans, according to recent polling, support a total ban on abortion. A majority of Americans identifies pro-life, and some substantial number of others pro-choice. A majority of Americans identifies pro-choice, and a substantial number of others support abortion in many instances well beyond what the restrictions are that the Republican Party is trying to promote. Not just life and health of the mother, but mental health and perhaps a number of other instances and circumstances. But if they can get the courts, they know they can push their agenda forward.
Well, your most recent op-ed in the New York Times, which was terrific, you talked about the rhetoric of violence among movement leaders increasing significantly, and this has got us really scared. I don't know how they justify this under their version of Christianity, but what's happening there with violence?
You're right. It's the violent rhetoric is being really normalized, and it's really deeply alarming. People are talking about spiritual warfare, which is a kind of idea that comes from sort of Pentecostalism and other sort of strains. And in many instances previously, it was understood in a sort of metaphoric level. Look, metaphors of battle are common in all political gatherings. But the way the rhetoric is being used now is so specific and so directed at fellow Americans as representing an internal enemy that I do think we're at a hair on fire moment. I mean, these gatherings, I heard Democrats described not as people with different points of view, maybe we have some similar ideas about what we want, just different ideas about how to get there. No, Democrats were just described as satanic, demonic, representative of ultimate evil, under the control of the devil. And this kind of rhetoric has preceded some of the most disgraceful episodes in our history, like watching Russian state TV a couple months ago, when the whole war in Ukraine was getting amped up. And I heard this one Russian state TV presenter say, these Ukrainians, they're devils, they're godless. You good Orthodox soldiers, you need to get in there and finish them off. I mean, this is the rhetoric of genocide. And we're hearing this type of rhetoric, echoes of this rhetoric in our politics today, and it's really concerning. We need to take it seriously.
And seeing violence, whether it's the attack on the Capitol or individuals going after whoever they're going after. I have to say, it seems somewhat ironic to me that the rhetoric of violence and kill FBI members and kill police or whatever, it just rings in my ears as the weathermen of the 1970s. I'd like to put those side by side and confront the right wing now with that comparison. I am terrified that this kind of attitude and this ends justifies the means approach is going to elect people like Herschel Walker in Georgia and Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania and every other nutcase that we dismiss out of hand.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do underestimate this movement at our peril. And I think a lot of people hear these bizarre statements and they hear about prophets and prophesying and spiritual warfare and stuff like that. And everybody thinks, well, that's just, not everybody. A lot of folks think, well, that's so far out of bounds. I don't need to pay attention. But they don't understand that rhetoric has context. It has history. People who use rhetoric like that are actually not sort of just spouting stuff that came into their heads. They're actually speaking from the sort of a worldview that they espouse and that others like them espouse, and they're hearing that type of rhetoric repeated back to them all the time. And it's a sort of echo chamber. I mean, one of the things that religious nationalism does is, in every instances where it appears, is it creates a propaganda that separates people from the facts. It makes them receptive to certain types of messaging and immune to certain forms of real information. So, you can present facts to people, you can present evidence, and they will discount it because they're so inculcated in a particular world.
And it's a worldwide movement. And, Viktor Orban from Hungary is invited to the conservative conference, and Putin is this way, and Bolsonaro is this way, et cetera. But we've got to give some people hope. Now, Ann mentioned some of the races. This week we can report that in a lot of the Senate races, the Democrats are looking better. I wouldn't take it for granted because a lot of money is going to flow into those elections. But in studying all this and in looking at our country, where do you see the hope?
The hope is in the struggle. I mean, I really think that, people have faced many Americans have faced horrific situations, and they've persisted. They've moved forward. I think about people who struggled to end slavery, enslaved Americans who are struggling to end slavery. I think about, people who were, had no rights in the workplace, working in these sort of sweatshops, and they fought for their rights to reasonable work week.
What about today?
Right. So I think that, we all have, it's an all hands on deck moment. I really do. Everybody needs to do their part. And when you start to engage in investing in democratic political infrastructure, engage at the local level, whether it's national, local. If all you can do is vote, well, take some friends with you to vote. Make sure that they're accountable to vote as well. I mean, I think if everybody just does more than they did the last time, we will actually we have a hope of righting the ship.
We won in 2018. We won in 2020, but by very little because of the way the system is imbalanced with the Electoral College and the Senate and all those kinds of things that are tough. If we don't change our systems, I don't want to be totally pessimistic, but I don't see how we can go on.
I think people are waking up to the anti-democratic nature of this movement. January 6th was a bit of a Rubicon, wasn't it? I mean, this is a moment where a lot of the Christian nationalist leaders could have said, well, we decry this sort of violence. Trump had already lost, I mean, they could have said, sorry, dude, I think some of the, some Republicans tried, like Mitt Romney and, George W. tried to sort of gently nudge him toward the exit. But Christian nationalist leaders, they spread election lies. I remember seeing a video of Michelle Bachmann, who was like, Lord, Joe Biden is not our president. This cannot be true. And so many other leaders spread election lies. And when they said that, it wasn't just like, I wish it wasn't be true. They said it couldn't be true. They said it wasn't. They spread his election lies. And another one of those pastoral network initiatives that I've written about called Faith Wins. So they're doing these presentations for pastors all around the country, thousands of pastors around the country. I went to one of their events in Virginia. There were maybe 36 pastors there, and a number of movement leaders giving speeches and presentations to get them to turn out their congregations to vote for Republican candidates. And they had with them, so David Barton was there. He was giving his fake American history lecture, so they can say America is really founded as an authentically Christian nation with, hierarchies rooted in the Bible, et cetera. And then they had an elections integrity specialist with them, a guy named Hogan Gidley, who used to work for the Trump administration. And he was there basically to spread misinformation about the election. He said a lot of dead people voted. This is the funniest thing. He goes, you saw what happened in Arizona. Now, this was after a bunch of Republicans had actually done this ridiculous investigation of the vote in Arizona and turned up nothing. And those were Republicans who turned up nothing. And yet Hogan Gidley is still there saying, you saw what happened in Arizona, because the facts do not reach the people that it needs to reach. And I think that a lot of folks are deeply concerned about the continuation of our democracy. This is a movement that knows it can't win in a fair fight. That's why they're determined to gerrymander, disproportionately race-based, but others in Democratic-leaning districts. They're determined to eliminate polling places and voting places where Democrats live. In many instances, they're determined to, pass these ridiculous laws, like that one in Georgia where you can't bring an old person a bottle of water if they're waiting in line for 8 hours. I mean, how?
Well, again, obviously the voters of Kansas spoke up, but where are the other Christian leaders, even Catholic leaders, saying maybe this is terrible,
right.
Or Jewish leaders, or others who are saying this is so dangerous to us? Muslim leaders.
There are a lot, actually.
Or are they a part of it?
The last thing, so they try and game the vote, but then they discount the consequence of elections they don't like. But the thing, what you're saying is like there are actually a lot of religious groups starting to stand up. So I think about, just off the top of my head, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. It's an organization of the Baptist Joint Committee. I think about Vote Common Good. I think about a group called the New Evangelicals. I think about Faithful America. A lot of interfaith groups are standing up. So this is a movement that is deeply concerning to a lot of faith leaders, but a lot of them don't feel like they have a way to stand up. A lot of faith leaders, a lot of them feel like they don't want to, lose their congregations. They don't want to, get involved in politics. They want to be apolitical. Those are the sort of responsible folks. And then you get folks on the other side who have no problem being political and say, you got to vote your biblical values. And it all reduces to abortion and same-sex marriage and all this sort of ridiculous culture war stuff that they use. to manipulate.
I remember the good old days when Southern Baptists didn't vote. I mean, that really was one of their tenets almost, that you don't, no, we're not into that.
But, that happened after, the Scopes trial. A lot of evangelicals felt like they needed to take a step back from politics.
1920.
Right. But then in the 1950s, you had people like Jerry Falwell of the Moral Majority, and he had a lot of mission strategists that he was in communications with. He was like Louis Bush or Francis Schaeffer, who had a center where he brought in a lot of thought leaders. What are we going to do to change the culture? They were very upset, again, about, the women's movement. They were upset about the idea that being gay would be okay. They were worried about family gender order. There's just a rage for gender order at the base of a lot of this stuff.
Well, they've been very good at scapegoating us and continuing these lies, and it is tremendously terrifying at this moment.
It's so cynical, but it's straight from the authoritarian playbook. All authoritarians need a scapegoat, and secularists, gays, Jews, members of religious minority groups. It's just, you go down the list. It's or all of the above.
Well, I think they reveal themselves when they talk, as a woman in Arizona was quoted as saying in a Time Sunday magazine piece this last weekend, that she yearns for the days of Joe McCarthy, and he was a really good guy. So we have to call a halt to this because we have to get to other news, but this just means we're going to bring you back all the time to continue talking about this.
And when you hear some good news, tell us.
Well, her other book was The Good News Club, but that's about the right wing too.
Taking over our public schools.
And I can't get out. So,
well, thank you for being with us.
Take care of yourself, Katherine. We want you to stay safe. And and the book is The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. We're really, really grateful for your work and for you joining us again.
And go to katherinestewart.me, which is your website, to read more about it.
Okay. Thank you, Katherine. We will see you much sooner next time.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well.
Whoa. If I were a drinker, I would need a stiff drink right now.
No, and I had to stop as well. Anne, I want you to start us off with our story in Florida about the decision over the woke thing, because I have to step away for a second. Can you do that?
Yes, I certainly can, because this is a huge story.
Thank you.
So there you see Governor DeSantis of Florida. This is a great decision by a Florida federal judge who has issued a preliminary injunction as it concerns private employers about the Stop Woke Act. Now, this is a law that DeSantis rammed through the Republican-controlled legislature recently that forbade private companies and the government from doing any kind of diversity training or any kind of training that, by his definition, made people feel guilty by teaching them U.S. history. Well, I feel guilty on a daily basis for U.S. history, so I don't like this law. So the judge says that he cannot tell private corporations what to do, and that this law violates the laws upholding free speech and due process. This is only a preliminary injunction at this point, but the judge said this is just an upside down interpretation of free speech to have the government telling private employers what they can say and do. That is outrageous and unbelievable, and is exactly the kind of nonsense that Katherine was just talking about, that the right wing is just totally reinterpreting everything with lies.
Did you cite what their defense of this of their
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
What the governor's office said about the judge's decision is this will allow teaching white supremacy. That's what they said.
Well, I don't know how they define it as white supremacy, but they, I guess what they mean is teach that the U.S. has a history of white supremacy.
No, what they mean is we're trying to stop things that are going to upset people, and whites, of course, what they want to stop is anti-racism stuff and stuff about gay stuff. But what they cited was, oh no, now, well, I guess we're going to have to allow them to teach white supremacy.
Because they
we're allowing that.
They made that up. But I want to cite the other great court decision. Now, I said this is a preliminary injunction. God knows I've got to stop using that phrase. The right wing will jump on this as a great opportunity to pursue this throughout the court system forever and be able to yell at us for having stopped their attempt to make people feel okay. But so far, so good on that. And then in Utah, the state, over the veto of the governor, the Republican governor, had passed a law forbidding trans girls from participating in school sports.
So a district court blocked enforcement of that new law about it and said, it likely violates the Utah Constitution by singling out trans girls and barring them from competition on girls' teams, regardless of individual circumstances. And the court said, this does not mean that every trans girl is going to be able to play, but every girl has to have the opportunity to do so. And if the law is ultimately struck down, a state commission will, look into whether it's fair to permit them to play. And this was brought up by the ACLU.
On a case-by-case basis, rather than the blanket ban of the state law.
I mean, we recognize that that the sports associations have various rules about this and those kinds of things, but you can't just say, no, nobody can play. And the ACLU and National Center for Lesbian Rights are the ones who are handling this case.
And if you want to know the extent to which this can be twisted and perverted to really be destructive, in Utah, there has just been a case where they have a girls' competition. The parents of the two girls who came in second and third went to court or their school or whatever.
No, they complained about it.
They complained that the winning girl must be trans because she doesn't look feminine enough. Well, she's a cisgender girl. She is not trans. But this is what laws like this and rhetoric like this can lead to.
But the Utah High School Athletic Association, on behalf of these disgruntled parents, did investigate the records of this girl going back to kindergarten to see what she was, who she was, and they didn't even tell the parents of the girl in question that they were doing this. They had a big hearing about this, and most testified against it. So anyway.
Well, this is just the insanity that is taking hold in this country, encouraged and fed and stoked by the right wing and their lies and their manipulations of people's minds. And I'm afraid this is only the beginning, and it's only going to escalate.
Well, we have another big Supreme Court case coming up this term. This website designer who doesn't want to do gay weddings, who doesn't do weddings at all, but, is bringing a preemptive case through the right wing.
It's another Alliance Defending Freedom or Liberty Counsel put up job to try to bring these issues.
Well, it's going to be the big issue in this current term. For us, at least for now. Who knows what they'll come up with. All right.
Well, and just for a little comic relief, Dennis Rodman has announced that he is going to Russia to free Brittany Griner.
Now, listen, he's serious. He got somebody out of North Korea. He met with Kim Jong-un. He says that he knows Putin pretty well, and he's going to help, to quote him, this girl.
Well, he got the person out of North Korea in part because he was in league with Trump. He was on The Apprentice. He has a relationship with Trump. So unless Trump is thinking he's going to get credit for this, I don't see Dennis Rodman able to liberate Brittany Griner. I hope to be proved wrong.
Okay, in Wisconsin, let's go to California. Governor Newsom has nominated an out lesbian, Kelly Evans, to the state's high court, the first out lesbian and the second black person. She will serve with Marlon Jenkins, a black gay man who was confirmed in 2020, if she's confirmed. Evans is a judge from Alameda County Superior Court, and she served as Chief Deputy Legal Affairs Secretary for Newsom, where she helped shape the moratorium on capital punishment in the state. She was raised by a grandmother in public housing.
She also worked for the ACLU. And in Connecticut, we're a little late on this because their primary was a few weeks ago, but we're catching up. Eric Russell is the Democratic nominee for state treasurer. And if he is elected in November, he will be the first black gay person elected to statewide office in the United States of America. Or let me put it this way, first out black gay person.
And the Victory Fund, which tracks all this, says the number of out LGBTQ officials, this is some good news, passed 1,000 for the first time this year in the United States, more than doubling over 5 years. LGBTQ officials of color grew by 12% over the last year, whites only 1%, but we are 7% of the population of the United States, roughly, but we only occupy 0.2% of offices. So we have a long way to go.
And that 7% is really the out population. That number will continue to expand as more people feel comfortable talking about who they are. Right. By the way, in a little follow-up to the Katherine Stewart interview, the White House has announced that on September 15th, they're going to hold this United We Stand summit, which is supposed to be countering the right-wing's extremist lies and violence. I'm glad they're saying something, but I think these White House summits are a huge waste of time.
Well, I don't think you should go then.
I want to know if Katherine Stewart, in going to all these meetings and conferences, is identified as who she is, or whether they figured her out yet.
All right. So in Wisconsin, the Kettle Moraine School Board now prohibits teachers from displaying gay pride flags or anything that they deem political. It forbids religious messages, Black Lives Matter signs. The staff can't cite their preferred pronouns in their own emails. And again, the community is against this. And the ACLU says, look, you're just targeting black people and gay people, LGBTQ people. Stop it.
Well, is this why Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson is now backing off his willingness to support the Respect for Marriage Act?
Yes.
To codify same-sex marriage rights?
He was for it, but now he says, it would just open up a wound. And I was told...
He's adopted the Marco Rubio line. I'm sure they're all falling into place, saying it's unnecessary. No one's going to overturn same-sex marriage rights, blah, 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 blah.
He's got a Democratic opponent for Senate this year, Mandela Barnes. This fall, you got an alternative there in Wisconsin.
Who's polling ahead of him. So presumably he's trying to shore up his right-wing base and give them a reason to vote.
And did you talk about the Michigan decision that we had?
No.
Where a county judge issued a preliminary injunction blocking the enforcement of the state's 1931 abortion ban that anti-choice activists say is now in effect now after Dobbs, after the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe. The judge said enforcement would throw the healthcare system into crisis, and the cost would be all to women without any to men, who he said, without a doubt, are a necessary component to create a pregnancy. There may be an abortion rights measure.
Longer, I hope.
There may be an abortion rights measure on the ballot in Michigan this year.
And thanks to Facebook, which has now banned the really outrageous right-wing group Libs of TikTok when they offended even Facebook with their lies about Boston Children's Hospital grooming people, 3-year-olds, into being transgender.
They didn't just say they were grooming people. They said they were performing gender-affirming surgery on 2- and 3-year-olds.
And this provoked death threats against everybody at Boston Children's Hospital.
They couldn't even do their jobs. They were getting so many death threats and emails and harassing phone calls by these psychos. All right.
Well, and that's the question is, we know these things are lies, but why are they reaching so many people who are then acting like this?
I want to give you some encouraging news. In Tennessee, high school students have formed teams for reproductive rights, and they're just going to teach each other about sex education and things because the schools aren't doing it. They're forming these new groups. It's peer education. You can't stop us. It's outside of school. We're going to do it. And frankly, that's a better way to do it than to get it from your teachers.
Well, and we hope next week to have on the author of a really major sex education book talking about this topic. So stay tuned for him. Also in Texas, in Keller, where we told you last week the school board had been taken over by Christian nationalists who were pulling all the books and examining them, including the Diary of Anne Frank and the Bible. The school board, after an uproar, has now assured everyone that those books are going back on the shelves. We'll see whether they all manage to get back there.
Another story that I found somewhat encouraging, very encouraging, in Wilton Manors, Florida, which is known as a gay town down there. Last Tuesday, a man walked into the gay bar, the corner pub, and he told the bartender, "I'm carrying a grenade." And he showed it to him. And he said, "I have a gun too." So the bartender, Joseph Shakespeare, he tried to calm him down, and a former Marine heard this in the bar, and he moved in and also tried to distract the guy. They got everybody out of the bar. They got him out of the bar, being calm about it, not grabbing him. And when they finally got him outside, they put him to the ground, called the cops. But wow, heroic.
Yes. All right. In California, West Hollywood has canceled its Halloween parade for the 3rd year in a row, maybe because of COVID, maybe because of monkeypox, maybe because it's too expensive, but no more Halloween parade in West Hollywood.
In Atlanta, their rainbow crosswalk was sprayed with swastika graffiti. There was an arrest of the perp made by a SWAT team. You can't be too careful with Nazis. You bring in the SWAT team. The vandal also wrote homophobic slurs and may be responsible for painting swastikas on the nearby Federal Reserve building. Do some handwriting analysis there, please. The crosswalks were restored and security added.
Here's one we cannot blame on the right wing. We've told you about a new LGBT housing complex and community center that's being built in Harlem called Marcus Garvey Village. That has now been delayed from 2022 to 2024. That's quite a delay. Inflation, COVID, the supply chain. Do not give up your current living situation yet. Yeah.
Unless the Supreme Court gets rid of the rent laws, I won't.
All right, let's talk about a couple of people who've died. Norah Vincent was notorious and infamous in the 1980s and 90s as a libertarian lesbian, and she wrote this book called Self-Made Man, where, not unlike Black Like Me, she made herself up to look like a man and lived as a man for about a year and a half. She ultimately found it so depressing that she gave it up, but
she went into a deep depression and she wrote a book called Voluntary Madness.
Yeah. She was quite the contrarian and an essayist for local publications here in New York. She was anti-trans, she was anti-abortion, she described herself as a neoconservative. She got a lot of people hot under the collar for a while there in the 90s. And she now has died at the age of 53 in a clinic in Switzerland in an assisted death situation. We don't know any more than that. We don't know whether she was sick or what. Certainly depressed. But
well, she was doing a big book on Virginia Woolf, and she herself tried to take her own life. So
she was a notorious figure in New York in the 1990s.
And then also Former Milwaukee Catholic Archbishop Robert Weakland has died at 95. Now, in the late 70s and early 80s, he was one of the most liberal voices in the church, such as they are, on gay rights, and one of the few who later disputed the official teaching that we're intrinsically disordered. It then emerged that not only was he himself gay, had been in a long-term relationship with a guy that he met when the man was a theology student, and that he paid hush money to this guy, and this guy accused him of date rape and got a big settlement from the archdiocese. Weakland denied the abuse, but he later admitted to relationships with several men. But he was also one of the many bishops, however, who let abusive priests continue to work. Now, all this kind of overshadows, he was considered a great social justice leader in his day, going after Reagan and the economic policies and those kinds of things. But you know, he's one of the few people who stood up for us, or should I say himself? Yes,
exactly. But a mixed record. All right. International news?
Well, yeah. Singapore, the prime minister there, Lee, the good news is that he said the government is going to repeal their colonial-era law criminalizing sex between men. Bad news is that his government is proposing a constitutional amendment defining marriages between a man and a woman. The sodomy law has not been enforced for 15 years. It's a population there of 5.7 million. The LGBTQ movement there stages an annual Pink Dot rally, and they made repeal of the anti-sodomy law a priority. But they're obviously upset that they want to ensconce this anti-marriage law.
Yes, and they said even though the sodomy law has not been enforced for 15 years, it has led to stigma and discrimination, and they want it gone. And so this is very good that it's going to be gone. It applied only to men, not to women, because as the Victorians said, you know, women don't have sex with each other.
Women don't do such things.
Yes. Fine, you think that. In the UK, in Guildford, there was a charming story. Historic England, landmark organization, has declared a shared gay grave as an historic landmark. We have on the left there Edward Carpenter, known as the gay godfather of the British left. He was a friend of D.H. Lawrence, Walt Whitman, E.M. Forster. And on the right is his longtime lover, George Merrill, who was a working class guy and became the model for the working class guy in Lady Chatterley's Lover and one of the characters in Morris. They lived openly in the late 18th and early 19th century.
Well, in 1908, Carpenter wrote that same-sex couples were not only natural, but inevitable. You know, I mean, he was out there.
Totally. And they were buried together in one grave. And so the British agency has now declared this grave an historic landmark, which I think is nice. And in Japan, a terrible decision. A trans woman who has a wife had saved her sperm from pre-transition and supplied it to the wife for the birth of 2 children. The court has now declared that one child born before the transition is legally the child of the trans woman, but the other child born after the transition is not, even though it's the same person, the same sperm. This is the distinction the court has made.
Terrible.
Awful. All right. AIDS news, health news, monkeypox.
Well, you know, there's some encouraging monkeypox news.
Yes.
That, you know, that infections or positivity seems to be going down. And then the CDC did this survey of gay and bi men. We have a chart on it. 48% have reduced the number of partners, 50% reduced one-time sexual encounters, 49% reduced sex with partners met on apps or at sex venues. So that's all really encouraging.
Yes, it is. But the CDC released information that, again, we know that Black people, in particular, Black gay men, Black men who have sex with men, are last in line for vaccines and treatment. These are disparities that need to be dealt with. And New York City is giving $5 million to community groups to try to deal with these disparities. But as we talk about giving 1/5 the dose, Black gay men understandably think, oh, I see, we're last in line and we're only going to get a 5th dose, whereas the white people who are at the head of
let's not discourage people from getting the shots. They
I'm
claim
just
to have,
telling you what the thinking is.
of course, and they are the CDC is targeting pride events for vaccinations.
Charlotte Pride, Atlanta, Southern Decadence, they will have a real presence there.
This is all over the news. We don't need to belabor it, but Dr. Anthony Fauci is going to be stepping down in December. Republicans are still, that's him back in 1990. He's been at this a long time, and he was at it before that. But he's been the target of death threats and things. He says, I'm not, I'm not stepping down because I'm afraid of all that. Bush is the one who gave him the Medal of Freedom. He still hopes for an HIV vaccine, and he was very instrumental in the development of PEPFAR, which brought AIDS treatment to developing countries. Long record, you know all about him.
Yeah, I have some mixed feelings about PEPFAR.
Of course.
For another day when we have more time, because now we're going to entertainment news, where RuPaul is about to break the record of...
has the record for most wins for a Black individual, but is going to extend it at these September 12th Emmy Awards.
Most primetime wins. Oprah and Al Roker have more, but RuPaul is the most nominated reality show this year with 8 nominations. By the way, I just watched the whole Ted Lasso. I'm a little late on things. I liked it.
I loved it.
Lasso, yeah.
I loved it. The gay-themed baseball play, Take Me Out, which won Tony for Best Revival, is going to be coming back to Broadway October 27th for 14 weeks, starring Jesse Tyler Ferguson, and who won the Tony, and Jesse Williams.
And watch A League of Their Own on Amazon.
I saw the gay-themed on that day in Amsterdam at 59 East 59th Street by Clarence Koo, 2 young gay men. The one on the left is a refugee from Syria. The other kid is an American. And it's a sweet story, beautifully told, beautifully produced with art, intertwining Rembrandt and Van Gogh and Anne Frank and the whole thing. It's running through September 4th there.
And we've been following for some years the story of the Dwayne Wade, Gabrielle Union family and their kids, particularly their trans child, Zaya, who is now 15 there in the middle. And Dwayne, the great ex-basketball player, took Zaya to court to file court papers for a name change. And they just seem to be a very loving family, and that was a great thing to do.
And you better get your tickets to the revival of Merrily We Roll Along at the New York Theater Workshop. Daniel Radcliffe, Jonathan Groff, and Lindsay Mendez starts November 21st, but that's going to sell out fast.
Okay, well, I was very glad to have Katherine Stewart this week. Let's have her back often. And next week, sex education, and we'll see you then.
Thanks for being with us.
Yes.
Nice to see you, Ann.
And you, Andy.